unclean spirits, to cast them out, and to heal every disease and every affliction. Then he gives us the name of the 12 disciples there, at the very, very beginning of the chapter. So we see Jesus is calling to them. He's going to give them authority. He's going to give them power, right? And then Jesus is going to send them out. This is what it says in verse 5. It says, "These 12 Jesus sent out, instructing them, 'Go nowhere among the Gentiles, and enter no town of the Samaritans.'" Now, why would he tell them not to go to the Gentiles? Anybody know? Because he's sending Paul to the Gentiles, remember?
I was going to say it wasn't time yet.
Paul was going to go into the Gentiles, so he wasn't sending them to the Gentiles. Verse 6 says, "But go rather to the lost sheep of the house of Israel, and proclaim as you go, saying, 'The kingdom of heaven is at hand.'" The kingdom of heaven is at hand. The variant there is essentially the kingdom of heaven is near you, or is near. So we have, what we see here is some imminent language, right? Some urgency here. The kingdom of heaven is at hand. It is near. Verse 8, "Heal the sick, raise the dead, cleanse lepers, cast out demons. You received without paying, give without pay. Acquire no gold or silver or copper for your belts, no bag for your journey, or two tunics, or sandals, or a staff, for the laborer deserves his food. And whatever town or village you enter, find out who is worthy in it, and stay there until you depart. As you enter the house, greet it. And if the house is worthy, let your peace come upon it. But if it is not worthy, let your peace return to you. And if anyone will not receive you or listen to your words, shake off the dust from your feet when you leave that house or town." So notice what it says in verse 15. He says, "Truly I say to you, it will be more bearable on the day of judgment for the land of Sodom and Gomorrah than for that town." Right? So there will be severe judgment on that town for those who don't receive them. So in verse 16, Jesus is going to be warning them of persecution. So far what Jesus has done is he's called his disciples, he's giving them authority, he's giving them power to do these things, and he's sending them out to all the towns of Israel, telling them to proclaim that the kingdom of heaven is at hand, right? They're going to be doing this, and then now he's going to give them some warnings about persecution that they're going to receive. So persecution, starting in verse 16, he says, "Behold, I am sending you out as sheep in the midst of wolves, so be wise as serpents and innocent as doves. Beware of men, for they will deliver you over to courts and flog you in their synagogues, and you will be dragged before governors and kings for my sake, to bear witness before them and the Gentiles. When they deliver you over, do not be anxious how you are to speak or what you are to say. What you are to say will be given to you in that hour, for it is not you who speak, but the Spirit of your Father speaking through you. Brother will deliver brother over to death, and the father his child. And children will rise against parents and have them put to death. And you will be hated by all for my name's sake. But the one who endures to the end will be saved. When they persecute you in one town, flee to the next." Right? So he's telling them if you're being persecuted, you need to flee to the next town. Go to the next town and do the same thing. And notice what he says here, "For truly I say to you, you will not have gone through all the towns of Israel before the Son of Man comes." So we see a sense of urgency here. We see some imminent language. Basically, Jesus is giving them a time frame of the coming of the Son of Man. He's not telling them the day or hour, right? He's not giving them a specific date, but he is giving them a time frame. He's saying that the coming of the Son of Man is going to happen before you finish going through all the towns of Israel. Before they go through all the towns of Israel, the Son of Man is going to come. So we can see right there that Christ is giving them a time frame, and it's going to be a fairly short time frame. It's not going to be a really long time frame. Okay. Okay, so we looked at Matthew chapter 10. Okay. So the Son of Man is going to come before they can finish going through the towns of Israel. So now we're going to look at Matthew chapter 16.
That's what we just did. That's what we just did. Read it. Oh, Matthew chapter 16.
All right, so I'm just going to give some context before we look at some verses here in 16. So in 16, the Pharisees and the Sadducees are asking Jesus for a sign, right? They're asking Jesus for a sign. He doesn't give them one because he says here, an evil and adulterous generation seeks for a sign, but no sign will be given to them, right? Then we see that Peter confesses is the Christ, professes that Jesus is the Christ. Right? And I find this very interesting as Jesus professes and confesses, or Peter confesses Jesus is the Christ. It says this, Jesus says this about his confession. He says, let's see, where does it say? Verse 17. Verse 17 says this, and Jesus answered him, blessed are you, Simon Bar-Jonah, for flesh and blood has not revealed this to you, but my Father who is in heaven. So, flesh and blood did not reveal to Peter that Jesus was the Christ, right? The Father did. This is a spiritual revelation. And then right after that, so Jesus is basically confirming that he's the Christ, right? He's the Messiah. And right after that, he's going to tell Peter what that means. Starting in verse 21. From that time, Jesus began to show his disciples that he must go to Jerusalem and suffer many things from the elders and chief priests and scribes, and be killed, and on the third day be raised. And notice what Peter does here. Peter has just confessed that Jesus is the Christ, right? He's just confessed that, and now look what Peter does. He says, and Peter took him aside and began to rebuke him, saying, far be it from you, Lord, this shall never happen to you. And Jesus says, but he turned and said to Peter, get behind me, Satan. You are a hindrance to me. For you are not setting your mind on the things of God, but on the things of man. So in the same conversation, Peter's confessing Jesus is the Christ, and Jesus is proud of him for that, right? Says, this the flesh and blood has not revealed that to you, but God, my Father, has revealed that to you. In the very next sentence, Jesus says, okay, what that means then is I'm going to have to go to Jerusalem and die, right? And then I'll be raised. And then immediately, Peter takes him aside and rebukes him. Says, no, that's not going to happen. That can't happen to you. And Jesus says, get behind me, Satan. Right? Get behind me, Satan. So why did Peter do that? Why did Peter think that was not going to happen? Well, during that time, the Jews really thought that the Messiah was going to be a political leader, right? That he was going to come in a political form and lead an army. They weren't expecting him to go and die, right? And so immediately, that's why Jesus says, put your mind on the things of God, but not on the things of man, right?
I have a question. Well, wouldn't they know from studying the old prophecies that the Messiah had to die?
Most of them didn't. Most of them didn't understand a lot of the prophecies, remember? That's why Jesus had to explain it to them. So, yeah. So verse 24, Jesus says this is, then Jesus told his disciples, if anyone would come after me, let him deny himself and take up his cross and follow me. So I just want to stop there for a second. Notice he says, take up his cross and follow me. Right? That right there is kind of a prophetic thing because Jesus had not been crucified yet. But he knew he was going to go to the cross at some point, right? For whoever would save his life will lose it, but whoever loses his life for my sake will find it. For what will it profit a man if he gains the whole world and forfeits his soul? Or what shall a man give in return for his soul? For the Son of Man is going to come with his angels in the glory of his Father, and then he will repay each person according to what he has done. And now, look at verse 28. It says, Truly I say to you, there are some standing here who will not taste death until they see the Son of Man coming in his kingdom. So we have another kind of time frame here. As he's talking to his disciples, he's saying, some of them won't taste death until they see the Son of Man coming in his kingdom. Right? So it's important that we understand what the coming of the Son of Man is in order to understand what he's talking about, because he's referencing a prophecy. Right? Every time he says the coming of the Son of Man, he's referencing a prophecy. And so what we see here is another instance where Jesus is giving a time frame. He's not giving a specific date. He's not giving a specific hour, but he is giving a time frame. It's going to happen before you can go through all the towns. It's going to happen before all of you die. This is the time frame. Right?
Hey, Nick, I got a quick question.
Yep.
When you go back to, if anyone could come after me, he must deny himself, take up his cross. You mean your own cross?
What was that?
Like, when he says deny himself and take up his cross and
Right.
follow me, that's your cross. That's our cross.
Right.
We got to be prepared
Exactly.
to die on ourselves.
Exactly.
That if it comes to that.
Exactly. We have to be prepared. And so that's the thing is what he's relating that cross to the cross that he's going to have to bear, right?
Right.
Yeah.
But we all going to have.
We're all going to have to take up our own cross.
Right.
Yep.
I think
Exactly.
that's another indication too, that it's not saying that God's gonna give you a great, easy, wonderful, perfect life.
Right. Exactly.
Pretty much.
A lot of
And this is the exact opposite of what the world tells us, right? The world tells us to find ourselves and all that. And Jesus is telling us to deny ourselves, right?
Right.
Yeah, the exact opposite of the modern kind of Christian thing that's happening. So again, I just wanted to point out that Jesus is giving a time frame for the coming of the Son of Man. And we need to make sure that we remember that. There's a time frame. It's not a specific day, not a specific hour, but there is a time frame that we're going to be looking at. So in order to understand these things, we have to understand what the coming of the Son of Man is, what it means. Because there's a big prophecy in Matthew 24, which is called the Olivet Discourse. We call it the Olivet Discourse because this is where Jesus goes to the Mount of Olives and sits down, talks to his disciples, and he gives them the prophecy. So if you want to turn to Matthew 24. So Matthew 24 is the Olivet Discourse. This is where Jesus is sitting on the Mount of Olives, and he's given a very big prophecy. In this prophecy, not only does he talk about the coming of the Son of Man, but he also talks about the Great Tribulation. Okay, that's where we get the Great Tribulation from, is from this chapter. Okay, so there's a lot of things in this chapter that Jesus is going to give. He's going to get real specific about the things that are supposed to happen before the coming of the Son of Man. Okay? Now, one thing I want to point out real quick before we look at Matthew 24 is in the chapter before it, Matthew 23, Jesus is in the temple. In Matthew 23, he's in the temple, and he's giving the 7 woes to the Pharisees and the scribes, right? He's giving them the 7 woes. Now, what does woe mean? It doesn't mean like, whoa, stop a horse, right? Woe is essentially like a judgment upon you. Woe upon you, right? Not. Whoa. And so Jesus is in the temple, and he's giving the 7 woes to the scribes and Pharisees. He's in front of a big crowd, He's in front of a big crowd at the temple. He's in front of his disciples, and he's in front of the Pharisees and the scribes, and he's giving them the 7 woes. Now I'm just going to point out the last woe that he gives them in verse 29. It says this, "Woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites! For you build the tombs of the prophets and decorate the monuments of the righteous, saying, if we had lived in the days of our fathers, we would not have taken part with them in shedding the blood of the prophets. Thus you witness against yourselves that you are sons of those who murdered the prophets. Fill up then the measure of your fathers, you serpents, you brood of vipers. How are you to escape being sentenced to hell? Therefore I send you prophets and wise men and scribes, some of whom you will kill and crucify, and some you will flog in your synagogues and persecute from town to town, so that on you may come all the righteous blood shed on earth, from the blood of the righteous Abel to the blood of Zechariah the son of Berechiah, whom you murdered between the sanctuary and the altar." Now before we look at the last verse, who is Jesus talking to? He's talking to the scribes, right? The Pharisees and the scribes. He's saying judgment on them. And then in verse 36 he says, "Truly I say to you, all these things will come upon this generation." He's talking about their generation, right? He's talking about them. All the bloodshed of all the prophets is coming on them. That's what he's saying. Then we see Jesus gives a lament over Jerusalem. A lament over Jerusalem. That finishes out chapter 23. Okay? This is all taking place in the temple. Okay? This is all happening in the temple in Jerusalem. Now look at chapter 24, verse 1. It says, Jesus left the temple and was going away. Right? So the context is continuing. This is not a new thing that's happening. Jesus was in the temple. He gave the 7 woes, and now he's walking away from the temple. Right? He's leaving the temple. Going away. When his disciples came to point out to him the building of the temple, but he answered them, "You see all these, do you not? Truly I say to you, there will not be left here one stone upon another that will not be thrown down." All right, so this is a prophecy of the destruction of the temple. So the disciples are coming to him, they're talking about the temple. He says, "You see all these? It's going to be torn down. It's all going to be torn down." Verse 3. As he sat on the Mountain of Olives, okay, so that's where Jesus went when he left the temple. He walked to the Mount of Olives. As he sat on the Mount of Olives, the disciples came to him privately saying, "Tell us, when will these things be?" When will these things be? Right? They're referencing what Jesus just said, the destruction of the temple. When will these things be, and what will be the sign of your coming and the end of the age? The sign of your coming and the end of the age. So the Greek word that's used here is aeonos. Aeonos. It means age. It means a cycle of time or a specific set of time. That's what age means. That's what aeonos means in the Greek. The word that's not used here is the Greek word cosmos, which means world or universe or creation. So the word that's actually used here is aeonos in the Greek, which means age. So they're not asking about the end of the world. They're not asking about the end of creation or the universe. They're asking about the end of the age and the sign of his coming. Verse 4, and Jesus answered them, "See that no one leads you astray, for many will come in my name, saying, I am the Christ, and they will lead many astray. And you will hear of wars and rumors of wars. See that you are not alarmed, for this must take place, but the end is not yet." The end of what? The end of the age, right? That's what we were saying. The end of the age. Verse 7, for nation will rise against nation, and kingdom against kingdom, and there will be famines and earthquakes in various places. All these are but the beginning of the birth pains. Now notice verse 9. He says, then they will deliver you up to tribulation and put you to death. Who's Jesus talking to?
His disciples.
He's talking to the disciples. Now, the best way to really wrap your mind around this, the best way to understand the context, is try to imagine that you're one of these disciples. Put yourself in their shoes, or sandals, so to speak. Put yourself in their place for a moment. And Jesus is telling them they're going to deliver you up to tribulation and put you to death. Right? That's a scary thought. And you will be hated by all nations for my name's sake. And then many will fall away and betray one another and hate one another. And many false prophets will arise and lead many astray. And because lawlessness will be increased, the love of many will grow cold. But the one who endures to the end will be saved. And this gospel of the kingdom will be proclaimed throughout the whole world as a testimony to all nations, and then the end will come. The end of what? The end of the age. So notice what he says here, that the gospel of the kingdom will be proclaimed throughout the whole world, the whole cosmos. The cosmos here is the word world, creation, or universe. Right? So the gospel will be proclaimed throughout the whole world as a testimony to all nations, and then the end will come. So again, Jesus is also given another time frame. This has to happen, and then the end will come. Right? We have a time frame given. Just like the other two areas, we're given a time frame. Now, about what time do you think this happened? What time do you think that Jesus was on the Mount of Olives given this prophecy? It was about around the year 30 AD. It is about when this was taking place, 30 AD. So the question is, has the gospel been proclaimed throughout the whole world? Has that taken place? Well, according to Paul, in his letter to the Colossians, it had already taken place by the time he wrote to them. By the time he wrote to them, he said it already had happened. So I'm going to look at Colossians real quick. Chapter 1. So when did Paul write to the Colossians? About what time frame was that? When Paul wrote to the Colossians, he was imprisoned in Rome at this time. He was imprisoned in Rome. It was about 60 to 61 AD. That's when it was written. When Paul wrote this letter to the church at Colossae, it was about 60 to 61 AD, about 30-some years later, after the prophecy from Matthew 24. Right? About 30-some years later. So I'm just going to kind of go over this a little bit. The greeting that Paul gives tells us something. He says, Paul, an apostle of Christ Jesus, by the will of God, and Timothy, our brother, to the saints and faithful brothers in Christ at Colossae, grace to you and peace from God our Father. So, what we see here is Paul is writing to other Christians. He's writing to other believers. He's writing to people who already know the gospel. Right? That's why he says that. So he's already writing to believers. But I want to draw your guys' attention to verse 21. Verse 21. It says this. Paul says, and you, who once were alienated and hostile in mind, doing evil deeds, he has now reconciled in his body of flesh by his death, in order to present you holy and blameless and above reproach before him. If indeed you continue in the faith, stable and steadfast, not shifting from the hope of the gospel that you heard, which has been proclaimed in all creation under heaven, and of which I, Paul, became a minister. So the language he's using here for the gospel being proclaimed is past tense. He's saying that this has already been proclaimed in all creation under heaven, and of which I, Paul, became a minister 30-some years later after the prophecy that Jesus gave in Matthew 24. So according to Paul, that's already had taken place. Okay. Okay, we're going to switch back to Matthew 24 again. I know this is a lot of moving around in the gospel here, but it's going to help understand a lot of this. So we're going to be looking at verse 15, Matthew 24, verse 15. It says, "So when you see the abomination of desolation spoken of by the prophet Daniel standing in the holy place, let the reader understand. Then let those who are in Judea flee to the mountains." All right, that's very specific instructions. When you see these things happening, when you see this prophecy being fulfilled, flee to the mountains. Verse 17, "Let the one who is on the housetop not go down to take what is in his house." Why would he say that? That's pretty specific. Why would he say, the person who's on his housetop, don't go down into your house? Why would they be on their housetop?
Well, they ate on their housetops.
In the first century, the Jews, at the evening, they would go onto their housetop and have dinner. That was the culture right there. That's why they were required to have a fence around the top of their roof. Because in the evening, they would always go onto the roof and eat dinner. That was part of their culture. So that makes perfect sense with what Jesus is saying. When he says, those who are on the rooftop, don't go down, get your stuff, just leave. Right? From a 21st century mindset, that doesn't make any sense. Right? He's being very specific here. From our mindset, that wouldn't make any sense, but from a first century mindset, that makes perfect sense. That's what he's talking about. All right. Verse 18, "And let the one who is in the field not turn back to take his cloak. And alas, for women who are pregnant and for those who are nursing infants in those days, pray that your flight may not be in winter or on a Sabbath." It says, "For then there will be great tribulation." So this is where we get, the Great Tribulation, the idea of the Great Tribulation. So notice it says, "Pray that your flight may not be in winter or on the Sabbath." Has anybody heard of the flight to Pella? The flight to Pella? So the flight to Pella was when the Christians escaped Jerusalem before it was completely destroyed by the Romans. So we have historical evidence for the flight to Pella. Okay. One more thing I'm going to draw your attention to here in Matthew 24. We're going to look at before we take a look at the actual prophecy of the coming of the Son of Man. So we're going to look at verses 29. And it says in verse 29, "Immediately after the tribulation of those days, the sun will be darkened, and the moon will not give its light, and the stars will fall from heaven, and the powers of the heavens will be shaken. Then will appear in heaven the sign of the Son of Man, and then all the tribes of the earth will mourn, and they will see the Son of Man coming on the clouds of heaven with power and great glory. And he will send out his angels with a loud trumpet call, and they will gather his elect from the four winds, from one end of heaven to the other." So now we have another instance here of the coming of the Son of Man. Right? The coming of the Son of Man. So we have some time frames that we're looking at. Right? Gospel being proclaimed. So now we're going to look at the actual prophecy that Jesus is referencing when he's talking about the coming of the Son of Man. And that prophecy is in Daniel chapter 7. Daniel chapter 7. Now, Daniel chapter 7, in verse 9 and 10, we see the prophecy of the Ancient of Days. The Ancient of Days reigns. And that's kind of where I'm going to start. Verse 9 says, "As I looked, thrones were placed, And the Ancient of Days took his seat. His clothing was white as snow, and the hair on his head like pure wool. His throne was fiery flames, its wheels were burning fire. A stream of fire issued and came out from before him. 1,000 thousands served him, and 10,000 times 10,000 stood before him. The court sat in judgment, and the books were opened. So we have kind of a setting happening here. Right? The Ancient of Days took his seat. The books are open. Right? Now let's look at the prophecy of the coming of the Son of Man, which starts in 13. It says, I saw in the night visions, and behold, with the clouds of heaven there came one like a son of man. And he came to the Ancient of Days, and was presented before him. And to him was given dominion and glory and a kingdom, that all peoples, nations, and languages should serve him. His dominion is an everlasting dominion which shall not pass away, and his kingdom one that shall not be destroyed. So the coming of the Son of Man. Where's the Son of Man coming to? According to this prophecy,
The throne.
he's coming to the Ancient of Days. That's where he's coming. And it says, and he came to the Ancient of Days. Notice that with the clouds of heaven, there came one like a son of man, and he came to the Ancient of Days and was presented before him. So the coming of the Son of Man is coming to the Ancient of Days. He's being given a kingdom. That's what's happening. Notice that this is something that is taking place in heaven. This is something that is happening in heaven. He's coming to the Ancient of Days, being presented before him, and he's being given a kingdom. That's what the prophecy is. An everlasting kingdom, right? An everlasting kingdom that's not going to be destroyed. So the kingdom, him coming to receive his kingdom, is something that's happening in heaven. Right? Now if we notice all the places that Jesus was mentioning, especially like Matthew 24, he's saying that this is a sign that's happening in heaven. Right? This is a sign in heaven. So what Jesus is saying is, when he's warning them of all these things, he's saying, as he receives the kingdom of heaven, or he receives his kingdom, all these things are going to be happening on the earth, right? The temple's going to be destroyed, Jerusalem's going to be destroyed, and then he's going to receive his kingdom. So sometimes the issue that people have is they don't understand what the coming of the Son of Man is, because a lot of times people think that the coming of the Son of Man is Jesus coming to the earth, right? But not one instance does it ever say that. Not one place.